Keir Starmer has set these rules, that he's not going to increase those taxes and that he's not going to borrow more money. So the question is, where is it going to come from? Because he's talking about being ambitious about growth. He's talking about creating a national wealth fund. His argument is that he can make the country better off. He can bring prosperity. But in the short term, at least, you're looking at some really significant cuts coming to public services and no way of averting those from happening.
Keir Starmer has spoken at the launch of his party's manifesto at an event in Manchester. He was unequivocal about his commitment to not raising tax.
I don't believe it's fair to raise taxes on working people when they're already paying this much, particularly in a cost of living crisis. So let me spell it out. We will not raise income tax. We will not raise national insurance. We will not raise VAT. That is a manifesto commitment.
Theo, I'm guessing that this leans into your number one takeaway, really, on the Labour manifesto, this potentially risky situation that Keir Starmer is setting up for himself.
Yes, it seems that Keir Starmer is setting the Labour Party up, or his future Labour government up, for failure, because the square hasn't been circled with the manifesto launch today. We know that growth is flatlining. It flatlined in April. It's not going to change anytime soon to such a significant extent that you're going to see growth leading to higher revenues and tax receipts coming into the Treasury. As Paul Johnson was setting out there, the Labour, Keir Starmer set out some fairly stringent rules, fiscal rules in that manifesto. So income tax isn't going to rise, national insurance, VAT and corporation tax, which is going to be set at no higher than 25%. And then you've got the rule, the separate rule that debt as a proportion of GDP has to be falling by the end of the forecast. At the same time, we have £20 billion worth of spending cuts to unprotected departments like justice, like local governments, due to come in within the next couple of years. And those cuts cannot be averted unless the money can be found from somewhere. But Keir Starmer has set these rules, that he's not going to increase those taxes and that he's not going to borrow more money. So the question is, where is it going to come from? Because he's talking about being ambitious about growth. He's talking about creating a national wealth fund. His argument is that he can make the country better off. He can bring prosperity. But in the short term, at least, you're looking at some really significant cuts coming to public services and no way of averting those from happening.
Yeah.
And Kate McCann, our political editor, interviewed Keir Starmer earlier. And in that interview, she asked him 6 times. And all he would say is, well, you can hear it for yourself.
That growth plan will go in from day one and we will see yield from that as soon as possible. I'm not going to put an arbitrary date on it, but I do not accept the proposition that we have to plan for the future decades and decades to come on the basis we can't change anything. That's the whole point of this
The reason I'm asking you about when is because if you do enter government, coming down the track immediately are £20 billion worth of cuts to prisons, to councils and to justice. Those are baked in to the plans that you have accepted that the government has set out. Under your manifesto, you've locked yourself in. You can't avoid those cuts without growth. If you can't get growth immediately, those cuts are coming to services in the next couple of years.
We will invest in our public services.
So will you stop those cuts?
We will invest in our public services. We've already set out in the manifesto what the initial down payments are in relation to our public services.
But you can't say yes or no. Why can't you give me an answer? Will those cuts go ahead under a Labour government?
We are not returning to austerity under a Labour government.
Yeah, I mean, look, he got quite a grilling from Kate McCann, and it went on a little bit further as well, we should say. Is he going to trip himself up on this? Do we need to hear something? Because the options are that if Labour do form the next government, Rachel Reeves gives us the classic, well, I've looked at the public finances now, this is in a worse situation than we were led to believe, and so therefore I'm going to have to introduce this tax rise or do something about it. She'd maybe do that through a budget, of course. I mean, are we in that territory?
Yes, we are. And there are some options, of course, because whilst Keir Starmer mentioned quite a lot in his manifesto, there were other things that he missed off. So, for instance, you could have a re-evaluation of the council tax bands. Now, for those living outside of London, living in the north and the Midlands, that re-evaluation could be quite beneficial. They could see their council tax bills fall as a result. But particularly for London and the south east, council tax could rise quite significantly because, of course, property values are worth much more down in London and the southeast, and so people could end up paying significantly more in council tax. So that's one option. Capital gains tax is another option.
Something which isn't in the manifesto.
Isn't in the manifesto,
but he wouldn't commit to not.
Wouldn't commit to. So it's the tax you pay when you sell shares and the value of those shares have gone up, or you sell a second
property,
home. So any gain that you make, and at the moment it's 28%. The Greens, for example, have said bring that into line with income tax. So you could potentially go as high as 40%, 50%. So that's one option where you would where Keir Starmer could look to try and raise revenue as well. And it's worth mentioning, of course, that whilst he is just as an aside, I suppose, that whilst he said he's not increasing income tax and national insurance, they're going to keep the thresholds as they are until 2028.
Which is an effective tax rise because we're all dragged into them.
6 pence in the pound up until 2028. So it's not completely correct to say that he's not going to be raising extra revenue that he wouldn't otherwise do by through those means.
What else is absent from the manifesto, Theo, that we might have been expecting or could have been there to help either this situation or indeed anything else? So
what was interesting is that Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves, Rachel Reeves has, of course, had a huge amount of input into this, they've dodged the question, of course, around green investment. They are looking at a national wealth fund creating £7.3 billion. But what's interesting, particularly about that I think perhaps where the sums might be slightly dodgy, Kate, is that £1 to raise for that public investment, for that investment plan to work, they need, for every £1 that they put in to that £7.3 billion pot, they need to raise £3 privately. And of course, you'll remember going back a few months now, they did have an original plan for £28 billion a year of green investment, and it got dramatically reduced. And the emphasis is being placed on the private sector. Now, of course, we know the perils that Tony Blair and Gordon Brown faced when they started trying to bring the private sector into public projects. It was called PFI, and the huge amounts of money that was spent on things like hospitals or schools, where you had private companies invest in those and then take huge rates of return, and also create contracts, long-running contracts for those projects, where they, as I say, often they're hospitals, in fact, where they had the contract to maintain the hospital, and therefore were tied into the government and the government was spending huge amounts of money that they otherwise might not have spent, but they had the investment privately. And whether actually the government, Rachel Reeves, what deals can be struck with the private sector, where the private sector get a good rate of return, because that's what they are after, they have shareholders, but at the same time the taxpayer doesn't get ripped off.
And look, to someone who isn't a big politico, borrowing for growth, which is effectively, this is part of Keir Starmer's plan for growth, this investment fund. Borrowing for growth is something that's not a million miles away from the downfall of Liz Truss. Albeit different in figures potentially, but still borrowing and relying on growth to be able to sustain that, as well as not to have to affect anything else to do with tax rises or beyond, is something that voters will remember. So he's got to be careful with this territory.
Interest rates haven't come down significantly
enough.
We're expecting them to come down in the next couple of weeks, and we're expecting them to come down. If inflation stays as low as it has been, and then I think it's going to improve, not just in terms of course, retail borrowing, in terms of your mortgage, what mortgage products can you get, but it's also really important in terms of what we're paying as a country in terms of servicing our national debt, and of course. One of the reasons for ditching that £28 billion a year pledge for green investment was that actually it was going to cost so much more at the moment, with interest rates as high as they are, for us to service that debt.
Theo, really good to speak to you. Thank you so much.